물들어라. 차가운 얼음의 화신.
구름이 숨고
물러가라. 내 명을 받들라. 좀 쉬어.
Hey, what is up everyone? In this video, I will be going over everything you need to know about Shenhe, including weapons, artifacts, mechanics, and various playstyles where she fits into. She is a very complex, intricate character who requires some detailing and optimal rotations to get the most out of her damage capabilities. And without further ado, let's hop right into this video. Alright, so let's talk about Shenhe. Shenhe is a cryo sub DPS slash support character who can buff your team's damage, but especially their cryo damage. She is tailor-made for cryo characters and fits best in cryo teams. However, there is a misconception that she only buffs cryo damage, and that is not true. She actually does buff everyone on your team, but she provides additional buffs for cryo characters, which I will go more in depth when I speak on her talents. Shenhe is probably the most complex character in Genshin Impact as of now, or at least in my opinion. It seems like she doesn't do much damage herself, but she actually does. It is sort of like when Kazuha was originally released, no one saw the damage he does because he doesn't deal a bulk large number damage in one go, but his swirl damage and infusion is off the charts, absolutely insane, right? Something similar happens with Shenhe. She provides a buff through her Icy Quills, which increases damage for every character in your team, and is actually a very nice buff. However, it can feel a little bit gimmicky slash niche because the buffs do not last long unless you optimize her rotations. This does go into more her mechanics slash talents, and I will go into more depth as we move on in this video. She may not deal huge damage when you use her skills, but the Icy Quill buffs are her damage itself. The Icy Quills deal a significant amount of damage through your other characters. She buffs your other characters in your team and further increase their damage potential. It's an interesting concept and it works differently compared to other support characters in this game. Think of it like she takes a part of herself and your other characters deal damage on her behalf. She is an exorcist after all, and it makes sense how she summons a spirit when you apply the Icy Quills, and you know how other supports just simply give a simple boost to whomever is within that field? Well, Shenhe is different, which I will further explain as we move on to her talents. So her normal attacks aren't too important and not needed to level them up. I only did it for this sort of Shenhe main DPS playstyle with Chongyun, which I will mention later on during the showcase section of this video, which I actually like. Anyhow, for general use, you don't really need to level up her normal attacks. I just did for testing purposes. Anyhow, her elemental skill, Spirit Summoning, is where her kit becomes very complex. Spirit Summoning works differently depending on if you press or hold it. I'm going to try to explain as easy as I can. So pressing has a 10-second cooldown and hold has a 15-second cooldown. Press gives you 5 Icy Quills while hold gives you 7. Her Icy Quills give you increased normal, charged, plunge attacks, elemental skill, and burst damage that deals cryo damage based on her current attack. However, the Icy Quills can run out pretty quickly because when you hit AoE, each hit counts towards the trigger quota. Each character in your party receives either 5 or 7 Icy Quills, and they are accounted for separately. So in a team of Ayaka, Kazuha, Shenhe, and let's say Diona, everyone gets 5 or 7 Icy Quills depending on if you press or hold independently. The damage bonus is dependent on the level of her elemental skill. At level 8, she gives you a damage bonus that's based off of 73% of her current attack. So this is another part of her that's quite unique, as the way she buffs is kind of like an anti-snapshot. Her Icy Quills buff your team even if they are off field. Let's say you forgot to use Shenhe's elemental skill before casting Ayaka's burst, for example. There's actually no worries because if you swap out to Shenhe and use her elemental skill while Ayaka's burst is ongoing, Ayaka's burst will now receive the Icy Quill effect. So in simpler terms, to buff your team, the order doesn't matter so much. However, it's better to use a specific order just to optimize damage output, of course. So as I was explaining a little bit earlier, her actual damage itself isn't too impressive. And by actual, I mean the initial damages that she does on either her burst or elemental skill. It isn't bad by any means, but it's nothing crazy. Except for her Icy Quills. Her own actual damage is the Icy Quill buff. It is her attack that gets factored into your other character's damage. She literally becomes a part of every character in your team, if that makes sense. On a quick side note, her own crit damage doesn't affect the Icy Quill buff. However, the other party member's own crit chances do increase the damage output. So if you were to use a damage calculation, you wouldn't account for Shenhe's own crit chances into the formula, but you'd account for 73% of her current attack. The Icy Quill buff receives an additional boost when, let's say, Ayaka would start attacking. Then, Ayaka's crit chances would affect the additional damage that Shenhe can provide through her Icy Quills. So Shenhe's own crit chances only affect her initial damages when the skills are casted. Moving on, there's another part of her elemental skill through her passive Spirit Communion Seal. When you press elemental skill, you will buff your team's burst and elemental skill damage by 15% for 10 seconds, and when you hold, you will buff the normal, charged, and plunge attacks for your team by 15% for 15 seconds. This is independent from her additional damage boost based on her attack, and this isn't only for cryo damage, this is just for general use, and Shenhe can be used to buff anyone in the game. So how do you know that you have the Icy Quill effect on? When you use Shenhe's elemental skill, you get this blue aura made up of letters, and you get a red arrow shaped aura indicating the other portion of her buff. But the next question is, should you press or hold Shenhe's skill? Usually I'd say use press since it refreshes quicker and you can optimize her better in your rotation. In a cryo based team, she still buffs normal and charged attacks when you press elemental skill. Also, you can get more uptime with your burst if you press elemental skill since you can get more energy particles. However, just to quickly mention as well, there are some cases where hold can also become more viable. For instances, when I want to use Ayaka's charge attacks to be even stronger, then I will sometimes go for the hold option. It's just harder to maximize her damage potential that way. So I generally recommend to press. However, there are some cases where hold will outshine press. So this covers her elemental skill, and I tried my hardest to explain it as simply as I could, so I hope it made sense. Moving on to her burst, Divine Maiden's Deliverance. I actually like her burst quite a lot since it's an off-field cryo burst that works similarly to Kazuha's. She does an initial damage slice and then she does multiple instances of a damage or damage over time type of burst. Her burst is nice. It does not cover a very wide area, but it is useful and the damage over time deals decent enough damage. Her burst can be useful for elemental reactions as well since it applies cryo somewhat frequently, but it is more practical for the cryo and physical shred. The percentage of the resistance decrease is dependent on the talent level. At level 7, she delivers a 12% physical and cryo shred. Aside from that, she also gives a 15% cryo damage bonus to everyone within the field of her burst. Her burst damage is pretty nice and I consider it a good burst overall, but it is not the highlight of her kit. I hope this explains her talents, but how should we actually use Shenhe? Shenhe works best in cryo teams simply because she provides additional cryo damage bonuses. She can buff any type of damage in general, but you miss out on the cryo damage bonus she provides that is based on her attack. In terms of rotations, preferably you would press elemental skill on Shenhe and then use your burst. The order doesn't matter in terms of damage increase, but for energy purposes, use her burst first. Then you would rotate amongst your characters by using their skills and burst and dealing some damage. If you use someone like Ayaka, you could cast her burst last and then go back to Shenhe to refresh the Icy Quills, which will further increase Ayaka's burst damage. This is what a more optimal rotation would look like the example I gave above. Shenhe also works very well in the burst spam type of team where you constantly rotate characters. One other thing to note is that Shenhe buffs every type of cryo damage. So even an Anemo character infused with cryo deals additional damage because of Shenhe. That is something to keep in mind when you're using rotations or when you are building teams. I tried my hardest to explain the best way to use her in your teams. This works for Mono Cryo or any other team you like to use her in, and this covers her talents and mechanics, so let's move on to artifacts. In terms of artifacts, she is fairly simple to build. The two best setups for artifact sets would be a 2-piece Shimenawas with 2-piece Gladiators since they both provide 18% attack, or 4-piece Noblesse. Shenhe can be a good Noblesse Oblige user if you don't already use someone else as one on your team. If you do want to use Shenhe more so for cryo damage, you can use her with a 4-piece Blizzards or a 2-piece Blizzards with 2-piece Shimenawas / Gladiators. I personally prefer the 2-piece Shimenawas with 2-piece Gladiators since Shenhe's Icy Quills are based off of her attack. Now in terms of substats, this sort of depends on how you want to use her. Usually I'd say the most important ones would be attack percent / flat attack and energy recharge. Shenhe has a high cost burst, so you want to have about 150% energy recharge at least to be able to cast burst on cooldown. Crits are good for boosting Shenhe's own damage, so it is still useful and I'm trying my hardest to get some crits in her build since her burst does deal nice damage overall. Anyhow, moving on to artifact main stats, you can do for Sans either attack percent or energy recharge, preferably attack percent, but it depends on your substats. For Goblet, you could do attack percent or cryo damage, and as for Circlet, you may do attack percent or crit rate / crit damage. This all mainly depends on how you want to use Shenhe. For full support Shenhe, go the attack percent route, with ER Sand still being viable if you cannot get about 150% ER without it. If you want Shenhe herself to deal more damage, you may use the Cryo Goblet or Crit Circlets. However, I prefer the full attack route unless I am playing a niche team where Shenhe sort of acts as a main damage dealer. The main stats to choose are dependent on your intent, and any combination listed here does work. But for full support Shenhe, go a 2-piece Gladiator with 2-piece Shimanambas with full attack with ER Sense also being viable. This has covered artifacts, which are fairly simple, so let's move on to weapons. Shenhe does actually have quite some good weapon options. Any attack percent or ER1 works just fine. For 4 stars, the ones I recommend the most are Favonius Lance, Lithic Spear, and Wavebreaker's Fin. Favonius Lance is great for energy recharge and also the passive. Since Shenhe does suffer from poor burst uptime, getting more energy particles is essential for her. If you have enough crit rate and or a higher refinement Favonius Lance, this could be a very good polearm to use. Lithic Spear is great for the passive since Shenhe is a leeway character, and it also gives attack percent on the main stat, as well as some crit rate. It gets even better at high refinement. Wavebreaker's Fin is good to use if you want higher burst damage for Shenhe, but I prefer the other two instead since they provide better passes for Shenhe's elemental skill. Now for 5-star weapons, her best in slot is of course the Calamity Queller. The passive is insanely good, and it has a ridiculously high base attack. It's the same as the Song of Broken Pines base attack. The passive is also absolutely insane. You get a 12% elemental damage bonus, and you gain 3.2% attack every second after casting an elemental skill, which gets doubled when she goes off field. This is a really good weapon in general actually. Moving on, another great option is Engulfing Lightning, especially if you run an energy recharge stance. This can give her great attack boost along with constant burst uptime. Engulfing Lightning is actually really great on her. Skyward Spine can be okay for the energy recharge, but the passive doesn't benefit her too much. Jade Spear is a good option, with the passive being nearly identical to Calamity Queller's. However, it doesn't have nearly as high of a base attack as the latter. Also, crit rate isn't that necessary on Shenhe, but it is still great to have. Staff of Homa isn't recommended unless you want to use Shenhe as a damage dealer. That is a viable option as well, which I will mention later on. This has actually covered her weapons. They're fairly simple, but she has some great options in the 4-star category, so moving on to team comps. Alright, so teams that Shenhe can fit into can be somewhat of a vast option, so I will give a few examples of teams that I have been enjoying a lot. As mentioned previously, Shenhe buffs cryo more than anything else, so using her in cryo-based teams is usually the best. First one up, and non-free-to-play option would be Ayaka, Shenhe, Kazuha, and Kokomi. This will be the basis of nearly every team with Shenhe. This can be swapped around though, so you can use someone like Ganyu instead of Ayaka, Sucrose or Venti instead of Kazuha, and Mona or Shinsho instead of Kokomi. Or we can even go further, you can even use someone like Chongyun and this will work just fine. It's just the basis of Cryo, Anemo, Hydro. So 2 Cryo and then Anemo and Hydro. That's kind of a simple freeze team setup, right? And it's the same thing with Shenhe. You can also run Diona as your healer, but you won't have freeze this way, so I recommend a Hydro character in there somehow. Using Cryo Swirl Kazuha is actually really good. It's extremely strong, and I'm very impressed with how much Shenhe actually buffs. Another team I actually really love is where Shenhe acts as a damage dealer. This team is Shenhe and her nephew Chongyun, along with an animal support, which in my case Kazuha, and a Hydro support such as Kokomi. Shenhe and Kazuha can get Cryo Infusion because of Chongyun, and Kokomi or other Hydro characters can help you set up freeze. Kazuha will also create Cryo Swirls, which can be buffed by Shenhe, and this is quite a good team. For this set, you can use a damage increase polearm and 2-piece Shimenawas with 2-piece Blizzard Destroyer, which can increase Shenhe's damage of course. Playing Melt Shenhe can be difficult, so I don't necessarily recommend it. However, it is possible to do so, and I'm sure she will work great with Ganyu, and I cannot wait to test them out together. However, I don't have Ganyu yet, which I will be trying to get her, of course. You can also use Shenhe as a physical resistance shredder, so you can put her in a team with, let's say, Eula, and an Electro supporter like Fischl, Beidou, or Raiden Shogun, and then you can add someone like Zhongli and Bennett for some additional resistance shreds and attack increase. You can also use Shenhe in the mono cryo team, so you can do something like Shenhe, Rosaria, Chongyun, and Diona, or you can swap around any cryo character that you wish to do, but those are also viable options as well. These are just some examples where Shenhe fits in, and there are more options. Generally, any cryo-based team will work, but these are some of my favorite ones that I have been playing with lately, and let's move on to the showcase.
Got you thinking. 기와 정신을 하나로 계율에 따라 행하리 명을 들어라
바람과 함께 낙엽이 지는 게
부탁해 벚꽃 눈보라 실례할게 하늘의 충격 장미 부여 캬
바람을 타고
So that has covered Shenhe. She is a wonderful and intricate character, which her personality reflects that perfectly. She, in my opinion, has a lot to offer, and I still want to test her further and build her even better to get the most out of her. I did get lucky enough to get her to C2, which I will be testing that out soon as well. Is she a must-have? Maybe not, but she is much better than what a lot of initial thoughts were. She is a great cryo support character and possibly one of the highest valued cryo team members right now. I'm not 100% sure on that just yet, but she can make cryo teams even stronger, which is just great. I'm having a lot of fun with the family duo combination with Chongyun and an animal support, and it's actually a great team. She pairs really well with Ayaka too, which is just awesome. I use Ayaka in freeze teams a lot, and Shenhe is very much welcome there. She is somewhat hard to understand what exactly she does, but once you do, you can fully utilize her powers. She possibly has the most unique kit in this game to date, and she introduced a lot of new types of playstyles, which is fun for people to try out. Characters that can change the way you play are usually my favorite, and she is one of them. She's fun to use, and I love seeing Cryo Kazuha deal an insane amount of damage. If you decide to pull for her, I hope this guide helps you out, or if you're debating whether to pull for her or not, I hope I was able to help you decide whether you need her or not. And yeah, let's leave it off like that. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel for more videos like this, and I'll see you all in my next one. oXevo is out.
Got it.